you go. Um, so we look forward to that, to get an update on that. First thing we always do is go around the table and introduce everybody so that we can, in case there's networking opportunities, not quite as easy virtually as in person, but please use the chat function to uh, connect if there's something that strikes, piques your interest. So why don't we start with Darko?
Darko Matovic, I'm vice chair of the Switchboard and a techie here. So, retired, semi-retired professor at Queen's and been member of Switch probably by now 15 years at least, and doing all stuff sustainable.
Thank you, Darko. I'll do myself. David Hindman, I'm the current president and board chair. Again, been with Switch for a good 15 years and drive a Leaf, run an air source heat pump, and always interested in what new tech and what new policy stuff is out there. I'll leave David to the end, obviously. Tony Book.
I'm President CEO of Greenbug Energy.
And okay, Tony, I think I've mentioned before, happy to have you guys do a talk at some point.
Okay.
It's just to learn more about what you're doing, support local entrepreneurs in this space. So we can connect offline on that one. Tom Lavriza.
Hello, I'm also a member of the switchboard. Um, I will be attending the IEEE Canada meeting, heading to Toronto right after this meeting. They were interested in my SMR presentation, so I'll be presenting that to IEEE Canada in Toronto tomorrow.
Awesome. Oh, very good.
Right.
And if your colleague that reconnected is there, tell her that we'd be happy to have her as a speaker too.
All
As
right,
I
if I
as
find
I
my kid there, I
yeah,
will speak to her.
yeah, I did reach out, but nothing back. So maybe you can strong arm her a bit.
Sure.
Anyway, thank you, Tom. Scott Simmons.
Hi there. I work with Tony at Greenbug Energy. I'm the head of new ventures and recently finished up a long sentence at the University of Guelph.
Oh, okay. Well, congrats for making it through. All righty, Maria Skodaki.
Good morning, everyone. Maria Skordaki from the Royal Military College, a researcher and adjunct faculty for both RMC and Queen's, developing energy as a director of an organization that supports the Department of National Defense. One of our initiatives is in energy management, and lowering carbon footprint for DND. So I'm very interested in station today. Thank you.
All righty, Soren Christensen.
Nice timing, Dave. I was just messaging Darko that I was making a cup of coffee, and I was concerned you're going to call me right as I left. But yeah, Soren Christensen, project manager at the City of Kingston's Climate Leadership Division. Always great to be here and learn something new this morning.
Thank you, Soren. All right, Carol McKay.
I'm unmuting. I'm just an interested observer, and I'm retired. And because I move in a whole variety of circles, I think that you would be amazed at how often I can refer to something that I heard at these switch meetings. And I just find that it keeps me up to date, and that makes me feel a whole lot younger than I am. A retired school teacher, as you can probably tell, but also a science librarian. Anyway, that's all.
Thank you very much, Carol. That tickles my heart to know that Switch has an impact. That's great.
Well, I do forward things to
Yes.
various people
Oh, good.
who work in these areas, some of which I think actually it's amazing how often they thank me for it. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you. Harriet has returned and is unmuted. So Harriet, your turn.
Hello, everyone. Harriet Waterman, formerly with NRC IRAP and a former board member of Switch.
Thank you. Rosie Hyde.
Hey everyone, a former board member of Switch and now retired.
And now you got time to do Switch again. Come on now. Hey. It's a small world. Jeff Bradfield. You're on mute there, Jeff. Oh, still on mute.
There,
we are.
can you hear
There
me
we
now?
are. Yes, indeed.
Sorry, I don't
No
use
worries.
Zoom very often. Jeff Bradfield, CEO of Lodestar Structures and Anchor Concrete. Glad to be here.
And thank you, Jeff, for your colleague's presentation last fall. So hope all is going well with that. Carol, Jillian.
Good morning. I'm the managing consultant at Location Strategies. We're economic development consultants. I'm very interested in leading edge trends in sustainability, and I look forward to the presentation this morning.
Well, thank you for joining. I hope there's lots to chew on. And Ken Dantzner.
Ken Dancer, Homestead.
Dancer, sorry, I
Sorry, I get Ted Danson a lot too.
Oh, well, there you
go. Homestead is residential property manager in Ontario.
Thank you very much. And I think I just saw Rob Miller join.
Can you guys hear me? I'm doing well. Good morning.
Yep. Oh, Rob?
Yeah. Hi.
We can hear you. And you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. Rob Miller. Local Kingston residents for 20 years, being into renewables during that time. And, I've done residential rooftop, but also utility scale wind and solar development in Ontario and across Canada. Right now I'm working with Interjex, trying to help them in the Kingston, Odessa, Tamworth, Enterprise, and Umpa, Ardoch areas, up as far as North Frontenac.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I think that's everybody around the table. So we'll move on to if everybody could mute. It looks like everybody is. And I'll mute as soon as I've introduced David. We always do thank our new and renewing members. And I just saw somebody come in. Well, we've got Mike as well, and it looks like Mike is connecting. Carolyn Kirkwood, pardon me. Could you introduce yourself for the group?
Morning, sure. My name's Caroline Kirkwood. I'm working with the City of Kingston. I have been a Switch member in the past, but I need to look into whether or not my membership has been renewed.
All right. Well, appreciate the effort. Try and keep the lights on around here. And Mike Book.
We've already heard from Mike.
I thought we heard from Tony.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But they're joined at the hip, are they?
I know. That is Mike. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Mike, if you want to introduce yourself. Anyway, yeah, right. Mike's with Greenbug as well. So if there's a good representation here from Greenbug today. So thank you for that. Okay. New and renewing members. It's a small list today, but an important list. Carol McKay, thank you very much for renewing your membership and your continued support for Switch and what we're doing today, or doing in general. So today we're going to hear an update from David Lazell. He's a emeritus professor from the University of Calgary. And is with the Transition Accelerator. I first got to know David when he was running BioCap Canada Foundation in Kingston, when he was a faculty member in biology at Queen's University. So our history goes back quite a ways. So today he's going to talk about trying a different model, an engineering-based model versus an economic model, to try and push the transition to a lower carbon economy, and that's through the net zero energy system transition model. And I think I'm going to leave it there. Hopefully I haven't butchered the concept, and we'll let David correct me or take it from there.
Sounds good. Thank you, David. And yeah, so what I'd like to talk a bit about is, over the last few years, I've been working on building a mathematical model reflects the energy system of Canada and its provinces and various sectors, in order to really try to accelerate this transition to a net zero future. And I think you'll see why I think it's necessary in some of the presentations. And hopefully this will help us to move towards a better shared vision for what an energy future looks like in Canada. I think if we look at the greenhouse gas emissions in Canada in the last, well, this is from year 2020 to 2022, you can see that despite over 25 years of climate policy, we've only been able in Canada to stabilize our emissions, not actually reduce them. And essentially, it's almost unchanged from where it was in 2000. It's, the only drop is really a drop with COVID. And I can tell you, when we get the 2023 numbers, they'll be back up here. So what I think is important to note in this is that 44% of the greenhouse gas emissions are actually associated with the combustion of end-use fuels in the areas of transportation, buildings, and non-energy industry. And then another 29% is associated with actually making those energy carriers, those fuels like gasoline and diesel and jet fuel that are combusted in the blue section, another 29%. So we're talking 73% of the greenhouse gas emissions in Canada are associated with those fuels. And that's not counting, on top of that, there's, of course, coal and natural gas combustion to make electricity. But so I think one of the things, our focus in the Transition Accelerator is saying, if we're going to actually get to address climate change, we have to reduce the combustion of these zero emission fuels. And you can actually look at the last 22 years in Canada, 21 years in this case, in actual the energy, this is the exajoules per year of energy in jet fuel, diesel, gasoline, and natural gas in the end use sectors. And you can see that, if anything, they've been going up. If you don't, again, you avoid the COVID years, virtually all of these, diesel especially, gasoline's going up. Natural gas has been fairly level. And so clearly, what we've got to do is switch these fuels out and replace them with zero emission energy carriers, because there's no way we're going to address the climate issues, because once you combust these, it's in chimneys of houses and tailpipes of cars and trains and boats and ships and airplanes. There's no way you can capture that CO2 and put the carbon away. This carbon is in the atmosphere, and so it's going to be forcing climate change. So what we have to do is actually switch to zero emission fuels like electricity, hydrogen, or biofuels, that when they're combusted, they don't add to greenhouse gas emissions. And we have to look at the associated technology to deliver the energy services of transportation, heating and cooling in buildings, and our industry needs for energy. We now have, in the past, we've missed our Kyoto target back here. We've missed our Copenhagen target. Now we have the Paris target, which is essentially getting to net zero by 2050. And this is going to require transformative changes, totally different approaches to the approaches that have been used in the last 25 years to address climate change. And the question is how do we do this? How do you make transformative changes in energy systems in Canada? And I think the questions we are really asking is, what drives transformative changes in energy systems? What causes these massive or major changes? I'm not even talking about driven by environmental issues or climate change, just big changes in our energy systems in the past. What has shaped them in Canada? And maybe we can learn from that to figure out what we need to do in order to address energy transformative changes in our energy systems today. Well, I think the answer to this is quite clear. You can go back through history. These are the projects that have really defined Canadian energy systems in the past and that we have today. And, it started with 1885 when the last spike on the CP Railroad, the 1910 to 1920s, we were building out the Canadian road network. In the 20s and 30s, there was a build out of the electrical grid in cities. In the 2050s in the countryside. In the 1950s, it was the Trans-Canada Pipeline, totally transformed the energy nature of Canada and brought natural gas that was virtually being flared in Western Canada to Ontario and really has helped to create sort of an economic powerhouse in Ontario. And that was the Trans-Canada Pipeline. And the Trans Mountain Pipeline is a more recent one, which actually gives the oil industry access to tidewater for exports. We don't have to go through the United States, which is becoming increasingly important. The Ontario nuclear program was 1970s. A large hydro like James Bay, et cetera, in Quebec, but other provinces as well, was all started in the 70s. And even the whole development of in situ oil sands, where SAGD processes, started in the 1970s. I think every one of these was government-led, often with private sector pushback, where leaders in the government had a shared vision or had a vision and was able to share it and get people excited about a better future by investing in largely infrastructure, but also other sorts of initiatives where there was a clear vision of where they wanted to go, and they put the infrastructure in place and the policies in place in order to get there. And I would argue that it's pretty clear, given our experience in climate change responses in the last 25 years, is that achieving net zero is going to require similar government-led initiatives. So the critical question that we need to ask is what does a competitive net zero economy look like? What is it actually, where are we trying to get to? And then how do we get there from where we are today? And then what policy and investment priorities are needed to accelerate this transition to zero emission energy carriers and technologies? To minimize, you have to minimize the cost of the transition and really get benefits of scale. We could have moved natural gas from Western Canada, Eastern Canada in trucks, but the economics would never work. We needed the pipeline, we needed very large pipelines to get the scale up, to get the price down. And as a result, it creates the jobs and the economic growth. And that's really what's needed to get to a net zero economy. We've got to talk about jobs and economic growth. It's not just an environmental issue. I'd say it's almost more of a jobs and economic growth issue than environmental issue is one of the things we have to make sure we achieve. So I would argue that Canada needs a new energy system transition model to explore these questions. And so we've been working, in fact, for about 10 years, I've been working on and trying to build such a model. And the last few years, we've managed to gain some funding and actually have just been producing this model. We haven't actually released it yet. It's one of the first talks I've given about this model. Essentially, this is the net zero energy system transition model is a bottom-up demand-side model that explores possible energy system transitions to net zero, but it starts really with we're looking at the 7 regions of Canada. Module 1 of the model, it looks at transportation, buildings, and non-energy industries. And for each, it looks at 7 regions of Canada, 6 provinces in Atlantic Canada, has 104 sectors and subsectors within those regions. You can have medium and small, heavy, light duty, medium duty, heavy duty vehicles and ships and trains and buses, etc. And then 89 different carrier technology combinations, like gasoline in an internal combustion engine, or maybe natural gas in a furnace, medium duty furnace or high efficiency furnace, or maybe as electricity in a heat pump. We got 54 net zero compliant carrier technology options, like electricity in a battery electric vehicle, or hydrogen in a fuel cell truck. Or, those are the kinds of combinations we're looking at. And there's 9 different S curves, and these are curves that define how fast this transition will occur to reach a net zero future. And they're based on the technology readiness level of various carrier technology combinations and at scale and what would have to be achieved in order to actually get these to work in a sensible way. In the model, we're developing 2 scenarios. Our base scenario is a status quo scenario, and I'll show you what it looks like. But essentially, it's saying we don't change. We just keep things doing the way we've done it for the last 25 years. We go for the next 25 years. And what would the greenhouse gas emissions and energy use in Canada look like? And then we can run one or more net zero options where we make decisions on what the net zero choices are in each of these regions and then feed them into the model and essentially calculate the model for the next section, which out of this model becomes how much gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, hydrogen, natural gas, electricity do we need? That gets to how we produce that electricity. It has to be produced without carbon emissions. Or if we are producing with carbon, we have to capture the carbon and store it. It looks at energy imports, it looks at energy export, it looks at the primary energy sources to create those. And so modules 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all anchored in our existing system, and we use techno-economics analysis. It's an engineering and analytical approach to project carrier production pathways at scale in the future. And the beauty of this is you can use in this part of the model, you can open it to various scenarios exploring what Canada's role in energy exports. And we'll show you what we're trying to do there. The premise on this model is that there are really very few alternatives that we have to get to. There's millions of things you can do to incrementally reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But if you actually want to solve the problem and address climate change and get to net zero, there's really 5 things you got to do. We've got to actually replace our existing fossil fuels with electricity, hydrogen, ammonia, biofuels, or if we're going to use fossil fuels, you've got to capture them. And so essentially it's trying to get down to what we really need to accomplish in order to achieve net zero. So a typical approach we use, we start with techno-economic analysis and engineering analysis, looking at the cost, and then we're applying it to energy systems and building them out at scale and saying, so we spent a lot of work saying, what would a big system, an energy system look like? How could we get the price down? We then work with stakeholders, might be trucking groups or the cement industry or the steel industry or the airline sector, to say, what are the most credible and compelling net zero choices for sectors and regions? We put that information into the NZES model, which is really a very big calculator, and it assesses the results and gives you insights, and you can feed it back through to look at the implications for Canada, including our export markets and import markets. And sometimes we look at it and say, okay, we got to go back and redo our analysis and redo the cycle. But eventually, the output of it, we hope, will inform policy and investment decisions. So let me show you a bit, before we do this, what makes this model different from other models? Most of the models that have driven climate policy in the past 25 years are econometric models. It's basically been driven by economists, and the dogma has been governments can't make decisions. The free market has to do this. What we need to do is to set up, price on carbon. We set up a few rules and regulations and basically the free market will get us to a net zero future. Well, clearly that hasn't worked. You can just look at our results. And what happens, it also does, is that actually incentivizes a lot of small things that will get incremental reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, but that aren't really on a transition pathway to net zero. And I would say ethanol, grain-based ethanol is a classic example. And it would be an example of a dead-end pathway that basically means we spent billions of dollars supporting very, very small incremental reductions, and they're really not going to get us. There's nothing in that can actually be on a transition pathway to get us to zero emission. So number two, it allows the engagement of end-use stakeholders, because the reality, they do the voting. This is all of the Canadians, and we get these groups to really, I look at scenarios to transition their sectors to net zero emissions, and and to see if we can build a developing consensus for what kind of an energy system in the future makes the most sense for their sector and other sectors in order to actually put together a vision for a sustainable net zero future for mid-century. And the other thing is it allows an assessment of how big investments in technologies, whether it's pipeline networks or big infrastructure or, different strategies, what's, interconnection, interties on electrical grid, for example, or, other sorts of initiatives, maybe small modular reactors or whatever, could affect the competitiveness and feasibility of the transition. And the beauty of it is transparent and modular. That's a lot of the econometric models are really far from transparent. They're privately held. So our plan is to make this model open and transparent. So give you an idea this is a status quo scenario for a Canadian model. And a few things. The historical data, this is historical data we have on the energy use, exajoules per year of energy. And in 2019, we stopped it in 2019, the historical data, because 2020 and 2021 were COVID years and energy use was weird, and it's coming back up to more where it's in 2023. But basically, remember that number, 8,178 petajoules per year. That is the energy in Canada that's used for transportation, residential, commercial, agriculture, and non-energy industry. And this is the fuels that essentially are the energy carriers that were carrying that energy. There's electricity, there's wood, natural gas, propane, jet fuel, gasoline, diesel, and there's fuel oil and coal way down at the bottom. So that's our business as usual scenario. And we're projecting with population growth in the various provinces and regions. And we've also got, looking at other trends. This is the expected status quo scenario. In framing the net zero scenario, now we got to say, what is the rules by which we're going to make judgments on what a net zero looks like? And the project, the results I'm going to tell you about today is only one scenario we've done. We're working on some other scenarios right now, but this one was done when we were asked to explore what the future role would be for oil and gas in a net zero transition. And so that's really the framing. So what we did in this is we said, electrification is certainly going to be the most important, perhaps, of the transition, especially for moving light and medium duty vehicles with electric, moving from gasoline or even some diesel into electricity. In taking residential space heating and using heat pumps to essentially get off of natural gas to heat pumps. In the aviation fuel sector, we looked at biofuels in particular for providing sustainable aviation fuels. And we looked at our models, our techno-economic models had shown us, and I'll show you in a second where there's some evidence for that we could make low greenhouse gas hydrogen available at perhaps $3 a kilogram available across most of Canada. And that actually becomes the economic decision maker as an infrastructure. On the supply side, which is the modules 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 in some ways, we're looking at a lot of electricity coming from wind and solar. We looked at what makes most sense for various provinces in Canada. Nuclear, a major role for nuclear, east-west grids for storage, and to allow better use of the wind and solar and to keep the costs down. Biofuels to limit are really up to the limit of we felt where we could feedstock supply runs out. And in Western Canada, we looked at hydrogen being produced from natural gas with carbon capture and storage. And in Eastern Canada, hydrogen ammonia being produced maybe from wind, as being talked about. A number of projects been announced on that. And where all the nations of the world, the assumption here is that all the nations of the world are also transitioning to net zero, not something which really isn't terribly realistic given what's happening south of the border, but I must say at this point, that's what we're looking at. So the export markets for hydrogen ammonia would exist, and fossil fuel would decline. We'll show you what the results are. Maybe I can just talk about the techno-economics of energy in Canada. And this is on the left side of this graph, we see the dollars per kilowatt hour. And those of us in Ontario, this is 7.6 cents. This is the off-peak price for electricity today. In Ontario, this is 15.8. That's the on-peak price for electricity. And this is electricity that you pay for the electricity energy. It doesn't pay for the cost of the wires coming into your house and things, but that's something else. Same here with this is the price for delivering diesel or gasoline. It's about $1.50 a liter to the fueling station, and then the fueling station puts a markup on there to actually deliver you the fuel. And what you'll see is that, these are similar price. About, $1.50 a liter is about 39 gigajoules and about 14 cents a kilowatt hour. So these are sort of all the same sort of numbers. What's really important here, though, is to understand that that is the price for oil. In fact, actually, if you get into the techno-economics, what the cost is to produce that oil, it's down here. This is the cost to produce a barrel of oil in Canada. This is the cost to refine and transport it, etc. And then the rest of this gap here is actually paying for a whole lot of other things in Canada. That's the royalties that are paid that makes Alberta so rich, and actually it transfers a lot of money to Canada. There's a lot of taxes being paid. All the road taxes to keep our roads going are tied to the price of this $1.50 in oil. The high salaries that are paid for the energy industry, all big government public relations, so they can do it, and lots of profit within that sector. So this is why the oil industry is so profitable, is because this is their cost, this is their selling price. It's really important to note that natural gas is even cheaper. And what I think the drive home message here is that when you buy natural gas today in Ontario, you're paying about $5.60. This is recovery, mostly in Ohio, for recovery of the gas and to store it and transport it and get it and make it available. This is available for the price on Ontario. And it's only 2 cents a kilowatt hour. That's the price of natural gas when you compare it to the price of electricity. And so what I guess the take-home message of this chart is that even in a net zero future, oil and gas are incredibly low cost. And in fact, there's enough when you consider the other real option is electricity. And, we have to talk about where electricity is going to go. We need low carbon electricity, nuclear or renewables. Seldom are people talking about the price coming down here to both produce and deliver that electricity through the grid. So what we have an opportunity here when you've got even hydrogen at this price, that you can upgrade it to natural gas at this price. You can take that natural gas. We're going to need a little bit more of it because there's conversion losses. And in order to convert that through autothermoforming and CCS, you can store it and transport. We could be looking at hydrogen with the infrastructure investments at about $3 per kilogram. And in some parts of Canada, we can see a price lower than that because the actual costs are lower, and it's in other costs in the process. So $3 a kilogram of hydrogen. You can see where hydrogen could actually, if you're talking about an energy conversion technology, which is similar efficiency with electricity, hydrogen could compete with electricity. And of course, you also, if you're putting hydrogen into a fueling station, which is quite an expensive fueling station, hydrogen could actually compete with their existing price for diesel fuel for heavy duty transport. So the way we do this is essentially in 2019, this model, this is 8,200 petajoules per year of energy. This is Canada's energy system. 8,200 petajoules per year, as we talked about that number before. And this is what the fuels are that's used in light duty, medium duty, heavy duty vehicles, trains, buses, marine, off-road, residential, commercial buildings, mode of agriculture and non-mode of agriculture. This is tractors, and this is like heating, cooling, grains and heating barns. This is all the major industry sectors. So what we've done here, and I won't go through details, if we done an analysis in the model that basically looks for all different regions of Canada, Atlantic, Quebec, Ontario, right through to BC, for what the net zero end future is for this is gasoline in replacing internal combustion engines, what would be the energy use and what would be the net zeros. And, we're looking biojet and jet fuel. We're looking at ammonia in marine, hydrogen in commercial buildings, what more cold climate heat pumps in residential for industrial processes. This is only 8 of about 90 different energy and energy carrier combinations. The end result is this. This is for Canada numbers. This is where we are today in 20 to 25. And this is what we are looking at as one possible net zero scenario. You notice that we've got traditional demand for fossil fuels have been reduced, natural gas and petroleum and coal products, about 93% reduction. Electricity is a 2.1-fold increase, a doubling in the size of electricity. Hydrogen we've got as coming on as a major role, partly because we've been able to get it to a scale where you could actually see it could provide, and this is only, again, for end-use demand within Canada, starting at this 8,200 petajoules and then rising. And then we've got biofuels, about a 5-fold increase in biofuels, and a big efficiency gain here. And this is mostly because we've switched from using gasoline and internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle, which is much more efficient, uses less electricity than it needed for gasoline. And same for heat pumps or for hydrogen and fuel cells replacing diesel engines. And you get some significant efficiency gains. So we then take the results from 1 and go to modules 2 to 5. I don't have time in the presentation today to talk to you about the details of this, but let's just look at the end results for Canada. And what I think is important here is we'll stop really at, what this model does is we look out to projects that are already in building and being done, like LNG projects that are already on the table. And we say, look out to take 2028 and say, we can't really start to really shift this energy system for another 3 years because it's going to take that long, to really start to have the impact. Obviously, in our model, we're starting things, but right away. But it's slow. It's a slow start. This is the end-use demand in Canada. We've talked about that's about 8 petajoules, right? 8.2 petajoules is just at the top of the yellow one there. And we export a lot of energy. In fact, we export in Canada today about 2 units of energy for every unit of energy we actually consume. And uranium is a big part of it. Oil and gas oil and gas are big parts. Where this energy comes from is here. This is the energy that comes in. This is how much we recover in Canada of various sources. There's hydro, wind, and solar at the top. There's biofuels and wood. Hydro and wind and solar are all converted to the electricity here. Wood and biofuels, some to the electricity, some wood is used industrial. And then we got natural gas, of course. Natural gas, some of it's exported, some of it's used, and some of it's electricity. So then there's conversion losses, and that's what's on the top up here. So then when we looked and we spread this out to the model, what the model's projecting is the end-use demand. You've already seen that graph before. And we see an export market in here. We're seeing a very significant market for, we need to go to nuclear, we need to go to uranium in order to make this work. We're also looking at a significant role for hydrogen and ammonia. On the imported side, where does it come from? And Canada has large uranium resources. It should be able to do this. We're looking at probably the limit of what we could take from wood and grains and grains and oil seeds in order to drive the economy, but certainly a reduction in crude oil. Natural gas we're projecting is not reducing that much, but it's being really converted to hydrogen and ammonia in a large way. I won't go through these, but the model basically looks at supply and demand on electricity, on biofuels, wood, where it's being used, on natural gas supply, on oil supply, on hydrogen supply, and on carbon capture and storage. I will stop here and say, in order for this particular scenario to work, we need to talk about massive because we're talking a huge amount of fossil carbon, where the economics seems to work. If we could get the fossil carbon and store it under the ground, put it back on the ground, take the energy out of the fossil carbon and put the carbon back in the ground. And we're talking almost 400 million, about 400 million tons a year, which is a massive number. We're doing about 3 to 4 million tons a year in Canada of CCS. So we're talking about a 100-fold increase. So that is a major, and a lot of that is about producing hydrogen ammonia, both for domestic use and for export. So the conclusion here is, if we're going to address climate change, we've got to really go to get to net zero. And in order to get to net zero, we've got to replace gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and natural gas with zero emission energy carriers. And that list is not very long. The biofuels, hydrogen, ammonia, or fossil fuels with CCS. The NZES model is really it's a tool for exploring possible net zero futures and how to really get there from here. And we're really hoping the model and the scenario I just told you, I'm certainly not the final one, and it's not the one I would recommend for Canada at this point. I don't think we're not there yet. But we're hoping that eventually the model will help us develop a more of a shared vision in Canada for what a credible, compelling, and capable transition pathway looks like, with a clear vision on how we can take the technology and actually achieve results. And the scenario that I just showed you, we did not constrain CO2 capture and storage, and we basically, gave the oil and gas industry an opportunity to take a leadership role. There's a real challenge in that model, in that the oil and gas industry are not really interested in this. They make a lot of money off of oil and gas now, the way it's used now, and the model I just presented, they would make only marginal. They would be probably as profitable as an electricity generation operation is. So it's pretty major. So we have to think about what the implications of that are. But it did project a threefold overall in the whole Canada, a threefold increase in electricity, which more than a 20-fold increase in wind and solar, and threefold increase in uranium production use, and a 5-fold increase in wood. 5-fold increase in biofuels, especially for aviation, and a major decline in the traditional uses of oil and gas, and a big shift in our export markets to more uranium exports, but also hydrogen, ammonia. And we would argue that more scenarios need to be explored and compared, and I personally think there's an important role for universities to do this, and for governments, as we try to move to a net zero future. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, David. And thank you for sharing with us as one of the first groups to see this. I got more questions than we probably got time for myself, but let's start with seeing if anybody else has questions. I'm not sure if Darko's monitoring the chat.
Yeah, I have a question if I.
Okay, good.
First of all, this is incredibly comprehensive. Congratulations, David. I have, in all my career, never seen such a clear and complete, sober view.
Sobering is that it's terrifying of how hard it's
It is.
Yeah.
So my question is, when you talk about conversion of natural gas to hydrogen, what happens with carbon there? Is it created as carbon dioxide to be pumped down, or it can be black carbon?
It could be either. In the model that I showed you at $3 a kilogram, with our current technology readiness level, it's autothermal reforming of natural gas. And the process of autothermal reforming creates more or less a pure hydrogen stream and a pure CO2 stream. And then you capture that CO2 stream and sequester it geologically. The first large 800 ton of hydrogen a day autothermal plant is being built in Edmonton now. It'll come online next year. And that's 800 tons a day. In order to drive domestic needs in Canada, we may need instead of 800, maybe 20,000 tons or 30,000 tons today, depending on, at scale. And we're talking about putting in pipelines and moving it around. So we're talking a major change, but the distribution pipelines for natural gas could be used to distribute hydrogen. So they're more or less compatible. The problem we have is the transmission pipelines that have to be changed. And so there's, but that's kind of, I think what's important is to really get our heads around what a net zero future looks like. And I think that's one scenario. You could take methane, and there are about 10 companies in Canada developing this technology, competing with each other. where you pyrolyze methane to carbon black and hydrogen. The problem is the price of carbon from that process, without even transport, just the price to make it, is we're up around $4 or $5 a kilogram. And then you still got to now, the beauty of it is we already have the natural gas transmission system. So with that technology, anywhere you have a natural gas pipeline, you could just plop on a pyrolysis unit and produce hydrogen and carbon black. What we do with the carbon black is a very good question, right? If you could actually turn carbon black into carbon fiber, or you turn it into graphene, or make it into a storage battery, wouldn't that be amazing, right? For a battery, battery storage with carbon black. Then that would give it some economic value and reduce the overall cost. And I can tell you now, companies we've been working with, they're all trying to figure out getting a value on the carbon black. Right now, carbon black is used in make rubber tires and black paint, right? And the total world's demand for carbon black is about 12 million tons. Canada could produce that in one SAGD facility. So, I mean, it's just, it's like, and we got 70 of those. So, we need another market for carbon black. And then the economics can work. If we can get $300 a ton for carbon black, but figuring out how you're going to do that, that's a lot of rubber tires. So, yeah.
Well, EVs go through tires quicker than regular ones, so
yeah, there's some truth in that. Yeah,
we can always help there. Let's maybe jump to the online stuff. Tom pointed out that I pay $40 a month for the wires and $10 a month for the electricity. Are we missing the major cost?
I think actually in some ways, you're absolutely right. That's most of it. And you look at your gas bill, it's probably much the same, especially in the summer, right? What you pay for the gas connection. I'm not sure it's going to be possible. The infrastructure cost that is paid for in that connection, I'm not sure there's many plans for really seeing how we're going to reduce a lot of that, unless you go off grid, unless you're basically just find a way to go off grid. And it's really hard to go off grid in Canada using solar, because when you need most of the electricity is in the winter and there's very little solar, right? And so, my sense is we're stuck. Our electricity still here is really cheap, even with that high cost. It's achievable. So my sense is, I would love to hear from people who are studying transformations in the electricity sector to say, okay, let's put into this model something that's really going to work at the scale. I mean, you see the numbers we're talking about. We're really got to think about something that's going to be the big levers we can move to transform Canada's energy system. And I have my fingers crossed, and I know Tom's on here in the call, and here's his talk last time about small modular reactor. It's hard to have people say, oh, I'm going to make that small modular reactor, and it's going to be under 8 cents a kilowatt hour just to produce it, right? 8 or 10 cents a kilowatt hour, or 12 cents is kind of what they're talking about. And now we haven't even talked about putting it on the grid and delivering it, so you're probably talking another 3 cents a kilowatt hour to do that. So I don't know. I mean, it'd be nice. I think back in the late 60s, I'm old enough to remember, I think, we're going to have nuclear electricity. It'll be so cheap, we won't even charge for it. We'll just give it away free, right? That was the story in the late 60s. It never worked out that way.
Next online question is asking why the model assumes, this from Liam, assumes most commercial industrial buildings won't switch to electric heat, especially when H2 distribution would require a major investment.
I think that's a really good question. And I guess the question that I would say is this. Apartment buildings, university buildings, hospitals, commercial enterprises, large commercial, it's hard to see heat pumps working. You can do ground source heat pumps to a certain extent, but we've heard talks in Switch, like from a local ground source company, even with a small apartment building, etc., that we're heat dominated in our system, so they're pulling heat out of the ground and essentially chilling the ground, and you can't put enough heat back in the ground in the summer from air conditioning, so to actually offset the need. So there is a limited role even for ground source heat pumps. And it's supposed and Kingston's one of the warmer parts of Canada. So there's a lot of places that are more challenging than that. And so I would argue you're either talking about resistive heating as a net zero future or hydrogen. And if you can provide hydrogen in a pipeline at $3 a kilogram, and that would be a regulated utility at $3 a kilogram, much the way our natural gas system is regulated today, then I would argue you can get hydrogen conversion to heat in a building at about 90% efficient, 92% efficient, something like that, with a condensing furnace. And you're comparing that to resistive heat, electric resistive, which is about 100% efficient. And so it really becomes, if you got anything over 9 cents a kilowatt hour, the hydrogen is less expensive. And the infrastructure is more there. I mean, the infrastructure, we have the distribution pipelines. And if we're going to be using hydrogen coming through pipelines in order to support fueling stations, for heavy duty vehicles, if we're going to be using it to support heavy industry for their production of heat for industrial processes, and if we're going to be using it'll be available in our natural gas networks. And I think essentially that infrastructure exists. What we have to do, the infrastructure we haven't built, is the transmission pipelines. And that's really because our natural gas pipelines theoretically could be used, but they are built with high carbon steel. And hydrogen in high carbon steel causes embrittlement because the hydrogen gets in and pulls the carbon out of the steel and causes cracking. And so you have to use nickel steel and or some other types of steel that don't embrittle with hydrogen. And so we've been doing sort of, what the techno-economics is of, replacing our infrastructure network. And that's really the big, we talked about at the start about the need for really a vision, a mega project. And one of them might be sort of a backbone of essentially a Trans-Canada pipeline, a new Trans-Canada pipeline, either a liner put down an existing pipeline, a plastic liner that could be pulled through it, or basically putting a whole new pipeline in that would bring hydrogen from Western Canada or from the United States. So we're recommending for Ontario, we'd be bringing hydrogen probably from Ohio or Michigan, where they have the geological and they can produce low carbon hydrogen at scale, and bringing it into Ontario and having Western Canada supply United States. But that requires this thing called intergovernmental trade in Western Canada, which is a little bit under question now. I think my sense is we need, as a society, as academics, as entrepreneurs, we need to really think about what we need to do to meet this problem. And let's stop playing around the edges. And we say, look, our problem's pretty clear. We got to replace these energy carriers. And I'll tell you, the energy industry out west, they're not terribly worried. They know there's nothing that's been done in the last 25 years that really suggests that we're anywhere close to pushing gasoline diesel. Their sales are going up. And so all of our climate policies, they basically, what they've done is they've moved coal out of power generation and moved power generation and moved to gas and moved to, so that's all we've done. So, and my sense is we gotta get more realistic about what's needed to solve this problem. And it's going to require some pretty big thinking.
Tony Book has a question for you. Assume you want to talk.
Sure. David, I'm going to sort of take off on your last point there, that this sort of requires some big thinking. And this is less a technical or economic question, as it's sort of more political, I think. Given that it does sort of take some big thinking and some long-term thinking, that's traditionally not a very political thing. so you know, it's great what you're doing, but I think I keep wondering, you know, what's going to be the uptake politically? Because as far as I see, when you look at what's happened, you know, even the Liberals sort of had the you know, the carbon tax, and that was sort of their policy, which they're now going to backtrack on. The Conservatives seem to really, as far as I know, their policy is no carbon tax, and I haven't heard anything other than that. So, and traditionally, you know, even in Ontario here, they're very, you know, very short-term thinkers, and this is a long-term problem. And I keep wondering,
Yeah.
you know, is there any, I'm just wondering, you're out there, you see a lot of this stuff. We're just sort of a small little company trying to do our thing here. Is there any uptake for this politically? Because you're talking about large investments in government and sort of investments at the start of your presentation, and I'm just sort of wondering what's the reality of that.
I think back in the early 70s, and even in the 50s and the early 70s, there was a real worry about energy security, energy supply, and governments got the drive to actually do things. And the major, you know, the big nuclear development in Ontario, the hydro developments across Canada, a lot of the big oil sands development, and there was provinces took leadership, and there was a lot of, but you know, let's be honest, and I agree with you totally, Tony. Governments in Canada, I've worked sort of as an interface between government and universities and industry for 25 years. Politicians tend to wait till there's a parade and then they run in front of it. They don't actually create the parade, right? That's the nature of our political system. And so you know, I am not expecting, my feeling is this purpose of this model and the purpose of the Transition Accelerator, which I set up in 2019 in order to do these sorts of things, is the purpose of these things is to really start to get industry, government, and to work together with, you know, industry and universities, to work together, and the government to be there and watching them and to really come up with credible, compelling transition pathways that are actually capable of achieving the goal. And we haven't been doing it. I mean, I would argue, as being a university professor for 40 years, we have failed. The universities are so siloized. They're, you know, their heads in the ground. They're all worried about working with this little company here. This, you know, there's a role for that. But until we actually start having, you know, the thinkers in our society actually come up with credible, compelling plans, or at least saying, you know, this is where we need, I think we can get sort of more of a shared vision for what this looks like. I think the politicians will see a parade starting and they'll get in front. And I think that's we have to start, the parade is not going to be started by government unless, you know, I mean, there is a parade being started by a U.S. Political leader, but it's a terrifying parade, I would argue, and it's not going in the right direction. But that one is actually, you know, but maybe we're not probably going to see that in this area. But
can I have a bit of a follow-up there? So do you see that? So do you see this happening anywhere? Is there any traction
in Europe? Absolutely. Like you see what's happening in Germany. I mean, in Germany, especially with Ukraine, they've started to say, look, we don't want natural gas from Russia. They're worried about, you know, they don't want to be funding that. So they're now importing LNG from the United States, and, you know, and it's, you know, they're paying $20 a gigajoule for gas. I mean, we're, you know, in Alberta, give you that, you know, gas sells in Alberta for about $2 a gigajoule. And in Ontario, we're $5.60. They're paying like $15, $20, and they used to pay over $30 or $40 a gigajoule per natural gas. And, you know, what I've just talked to you about, making hydrogen from natural gas, does not work in Europe.
So this parade sort of got to start this parade. Is this parade going to be started by sort of like, is there anything, you know, sort of little people like us can do? Or do we have to wait for this parade to start and then join it?
Well, I mean, I think what's entrepreneurs is start thinking about how your technology can scale. Because I think what we're looking for is a big levers. And I think we need to scale, we need to figure out where we fit within a bigger system, right? In terms of, and I mean, you've got run of the river hydro and things, you got some really neat ideas. Figure out where that niche is and where it could work and how it could, contribute. But I think all of the companies, I would argue we need to start thinking of where we fit within a bigger picture, and we need a framework. Really, the model's about giving that framework to say, okay, how big is the problem? Where's our possible market niche? A lot of the issues, and as mentioned before, a lot of the challenges is the cost of, the grid cost and the grid cost of delivering it. So if one could be off grid, it'd be fantastic, right? How do you actually achieve that, right? That would be good. Maybe I can just go down a list. There's a comment from Harriet about oil companies make profits. I'll tell you, Harriet, this is one that is the hardest. I mean, we basically have to think about, we're relying in Canada, we're over-reliant on the profits of the oil industry, supporting Canada, supporting the Alberta government, supporting the Canadian government, fund transfers between provinces. I mean, you follow the money, and that's what's happening. And what we are got to do is say, if we're going to stop using gasoline and diesel, all of a sudden those profits are going to go down. We know that, right? What are we going to do? So I would argue a lot of this is about thinking economic development. In the Transition Accelerator, we set up a whole group looking at, critical minerals. If we're going to go to more electrification and battery electrics, we need battery technologies. We need fuel cell technologies. We need other sort of mining and energy support technologies. We also, I don't know if people are following this, but there's some really exciting work in Canada, and even in Temiskaming, just north of, along the Ontario-Quebec border. They've been finding natural hydrogen leaking out of the ground, right? It's hundreds of parts per million, which is just amazing concentration coming right out of the ground. And there's a bunch of drilling companies that are set up. And if they can drill and find, there's estimate of publication 2 weeks ago from the United States Geological Survey, which may cease to exist soon, but that saying, there's enough buried in the crust of the earth, pockets of hydrogen that could provide all the energy needs of the world for hundreds of years, right? And this would be more or less pure hydrogen, like 96, 98% hydrogen that could be mined. And it could be pulled up at about, they say, between 50 cents to $1 a kilogram. So that's, a third or even a sixth of the price that I said we would need. And then, of course, you've got to transport it down, clean it up a bit and transport it. But I think, those would be game-changing technologies. And I think, maybe we've got to figure out where we're going to get in and make money and keep our economy going when if we're going to be pulling away from oil and gas, traditional use of oil and gas.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're off fossil fuels here, electric vehicles, electric snow blowers, you name it. But, the only way I see it working is if somehow they can switch. There's got to be an incentive for the oil and gas industry to morph into something else where they can, in fact, make a reasonable level of profit while doing what we all want them to do.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Yeah. The last, Maria has a question there, and I know we're running out of time, but on the really important issue about Arctic, we've done a lot of work. We've got a big project we're doing now with the Northwest Territories and they got about 35 communities there that are off grid. They only have access once a year. They're basically about 65% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the Northwest Territories comes from diesel fuel use in trucks, right? And then another 10 to 15% of diesel fuel use to make electricity and heat for local communities. I mean, their emissions are basically diesel. And so we've been trying to design a net zero scenario for Northwest Territories. And I had a graduate student who worked on this, and then we got asked to do a study with the Northwest Territories, and that study's just being completed now. I mean, it's a tough one. The economics doesn't work very well, but the one that the most promising at this stage is the Northwest Territories got a massive amount of hydro capacity that's untapped. You got to get First Nations involved because they got to be totally engaged with, with tapping the hydro. The hydro could actually be converted to hydrogen and then to ammonia. And the ammonia can be stored and moved very much the same way we move diesel fuel. And you can actually drive trucks. There's companies that are making trucks that can drive on ammonia. And there's a company called Emoji, which I've been watching very carefully, which they basically put ammonia on board of vehicles. They have it on ships, and they've done trucks and tractors. And then just before the fuel is being used, they convert the ammonia to hydrogen, and they run it through a fuel cell. And so that technology, amogy.co is the website, is a really interesting company. They've just raised another 50 or 100 million bucks. And this is basically ammonia. And we're working with another company. It's an Ontario company. It's out of Waterloo, but they're just moving to Manitoba now. And I was out at their site back in November. What they're doing is they're using solar energy and grid energy to make hydrogen in the middle of a farmer's field. It's an 11,000 acre farm. So these are big farms in Manitoba. It uses about 700 tons a year of ammonia as a fertilizer. And they get cheesed off because, the fertilizer companies are charging them about $1,200 a ton for their fertilizer, and they want to make it less expensively. So they're now, the company's just been set up. They are converting they're converting grid electricity and solar at the farm into hydrogen, and making the hydrogen into ammonia using a technology out of Ontario Institute of Technology, the UOIT. It's a Dancer Technologies, really kind of small scale ammonia production. And then they basically make that ammonia and use it as a fertilizer. They got a 100 ton a year facility they've just built. And we should actually, if you want to get a group, I can arrange for those guys to give a talk to this group if anybody's interested. But it's basically small scale renewable ammonia, green ammonia production. And if they can work, they think they can produce it for under $1,000 a ton. At really small scale, about 100 to 300 tons a year, right? And at that, they would pop one of these on virtually every farm in Manitoba, the larger farms, and they could actually produce ammonia that could be used as a fuel as well in the tractors, and they could even produce more. And it's an interesting model, and I think one that we've been trying to help that company make connections and try to raise some funds. So.
Oh, thank you, David. No, it's actually, and thank you for your presentation. So enlightening, the information. But you see, the Arctic is actually a priority, huge priority for D&D, and we're starting up sites that had been closed down for decades, and they all need energy. So, and what you mentioned, right, North Warning Science, yeah. So very heavily involved in that, and being able to power them in a green way, obviously.
Absolutely.
Right? And what you mentioned about transporting fuel. So transporting ammonia is easy. Transporting methanol is easy. Like, okay, safe.
Yeah.
But yes, but what you mentioned about perhaps even engaging local communities to produce on site, that's really attractive what you mentioned. I'm keeping notes as you're speaking.
Well, I'd love to chat with you about this, Maria. I spent a bunch of time up in Resolute Bay, and we went up to Grise Fiord and a bunch on, and looking at their diesel storage facilities. I mean, and they bring it in once a year if they're lucky. They bring it in if they bring enough.
If they're lucky, you're right.
A whole year's worth of energy.
Yes,
that's transformative, right?
Absolutely. And we have, I'm a frequent, like up in Alert actually, because I take care of the water treatment plant, the wastewater facility. They have let's say facility up there, but for water. And as you see, taking, the jet fuel, it runs on jet fuel. But now we have solar panels. We're so proud.
Yes.
We have solar panels. But imagine, if we're trying to get fuel cells up there.
Exactly.
So that's it would be wonderful if we could connect it, actually, David,
I'd love to.
after.
Yeah.
Thank
Okay.
you so much. Thank you.
I work with both of you, so I'll make a connection there. I'll make an introduction.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I said I had a bunch of questions. I know we're starting to get close to the end, but I got to ask one, and it's a more of a technical one. Carbon capture and storage. I always worry about the storage part. How leaky is this going to be, and are we just pushing the problem down the road?
That's a good question. I think there are large pockets. We're the storage locations, they have to be carefully monitored. What Alberta government's done, which I think has been wise, is they've put it through high regulation that you can't just store CO2 anywhere. And they're basically forcing everybody to get into consortia and treating essentially CO2 storage as kind of like a regulated sector. And so you're going to have to, and I think where it gets is you have to be looking at the right size. You have to get size up. We're really talking minimum of 2 million tons a year for a storage site to 4 million tons a year. And when you get to the 2 to 4 million tons a year site, now we are talking about the economics is good enough. You can do the storage at about $10 to $15 a ton, right? Which is not very expensive. And some pay even less than that. And you actually can put in money aside to basically do long-term monitoring, right? And what they do is they drill down and on the way down, and they put basically little sensors down in and looking for pH and water changes in water down. Storage is always done lower than 800 meters below the surface because that's where CO2 at about 800 meters CO2 turns into a liquid, right?
Okay.
And you get liquefied CO2 and supercritical liquid. And then, below that, then what you want is also put it in where there's limestone or where carbonate or calcium around. And essentially the CO2 over time will turn into rock. And as it sort of leaches out in minerals and things. So I've been told that it's the probability is very safe. The biggest challenge is in Alberta, where they sort of have, they got holes drilled all over the countryside that, what the plume that is a CO2 plume hits an abandoned well and starts coming up, in which case you want to catch it. So it's, you want to really know your geology of the area. But what we did a bunch of work on at the university, there's a group, not me personally, but I was sort of responsible for overseeing it, and on CO2 storage, long-term storage. And I was impressed of how much carbon you can get into an area like 5 kilometer by 5 kilometers or something, or 10 kilometers by 10. So you really need to really do very careful seismic on the area, and you can put millions and millions of tons down. So, but it has to be under cap rock and everything. It just has to be done properly. So I think it can be done safely, but the problem is, what choice do we have, Dave? I mean, pick your poison, right? I guess, the issue is we are going to need nuclear. We are going to need carbon capture and storage. We're going to need a lot more wind and solar. We're going to need all of these. And just look at the model, like just look at look at the scale of our energy system. If we want this lifestyle, the other thing is we change our lifestyle pretty dramatically. And I would say almost that's harder.
Yeah. Even those of us that are
trying to do it, even the
trying to do it,
I wondered when change of lifestyle might enter the picture.
Well,
I also would like to say that isn't Iceland doing something with that carbon and turning it into rock? I think they've got a project going on there. And I also want to suggest, because I don't know anything about it and I think it's fascinating, there is an absolutely massive solar panel project in Morocco, and I think it's called Aura, A-U-R-A, and there was a television program about it. But by 2050, apparently all of this is somehow going to be used to produce hydrogen. And it was fascinating. And I think you're talking about major transformation of systems. You might want to look into this. Just find it. You can find out. Aura, and it's in Morocco. It is spectacularly beautiful. And the other thing is, look at what Holland's doing, because it was my understanding a few years ago that Rotterdam had already been declared a hydrogen port, and they're refitting ships to carry hydrogen. And I know they're working with Iceland. Anyway, I love this talk. I didn't, when I read the write-up, I thought, oh God, I'm not going to understand anything. But there was hydrogen, and hydrogen being suggested as a viable energy source. And I do know that the Society of Chemists in 2017, the Royal Society in Britain, produced a very comprehensive overview, which was primarily from the scientific viewpoint. But their conclusion was that because the price of hydrogen is coming down, it was a completely viable resource. And I wonder if you've seen it. I have a copy, and I know Switch probably has, because when I went in about hydrogen a few years ago, it was one of the papers that I thought was most persuasive. Anyway, thanks very much. I loved this talk.
Thank you, Carol. That means a lot to me. Thank you. And I think you're right on in terms of, I mean, Morocco's, even especially in northern Canada, they get incredible sun for 6 months of the year. And they can produce a lot more. The solar, and I'm surprised at looking at their solar data, how good it is for part of the year, right? It's very dark for half of the year. So they have to store energy, and storing electrical energy is really a challenge. You can do, this, and especially at low cost, and then you need to be able to move it and tap it when you need it. So I think.
But isn't that what they're looking at, the hydrogen part?
That's really hydrogen and ammonia. And ammonia is made from hydrogen.
Yep.
So you make hydrogen, and hydrogen's hard to store as well because it's a gas and it's leaking. It costs a lot to compress it, and it takes a lot of volume, and you need thick containers, and it's heavy and blah, blah, blah. So ammonia is becoming more interesting, but ammonia is pretty toxic. And so we just gotta, so there's no quick lunch here, but we've got to figure it out. And matter of fact, that's, my sense is.
My interest is the small scale models. So you don't have to worry about pipelines and anything else. And I also, do you know the little Stewart electrolyzer?
Yes.
Developed in Canada, been shipping and still shipped all over the world to make ammonia. Anyway, I don't know, but I think somebody mentioned the hydro lines. Is it actually factored into the cost of our electricity? And you look at Canada and you think, God, we're the worst country in the world to be dependent on massive hydroelectric projects, other than if you're in Montreal or, Toronto, really close to one, because we're always having blizzards and storms and repairing lines. Anyway, whatever. I love the talk.
Thank you.
And good luck.
I think maybe we'll throw news briefs and collaboration to the wind today. There's lots of questions. Rob, do you want me to just read out your question, or do you want to jump on and deal with it?
Well, no, David. I'm just interested in your comment there when you're working with a lot of northern communities. I'm assuming there's roughly 200 First Nations northern communities that are off grid, and they have diesel generators.
Yep.
And in the renewable space, that's sort of one area that's near and dear to a lot of people's hearts to go in. They're probably still going to need the backup diesel generators, but get them the right technology mix you can't put in 1.5, 2 megawatt, whatever, huge wind turbines, because you don't want to put in one. You need a fleet of smaller turbines, and then you need a little bit of solar PV. And, today you're probably going to have some battery storage and then go from there. But, I'd be happy to look at that. Like Graham and I are dealing with two different quarries. One of them is Lafarge Meldrum Bay.
Oh, okay.
It's 5 megawatts of diesel right now, and there's a Hydro One service up there, but we're working with them and partnering with the First Nations who might own the microgrid and then act as sort of the LDC. And then I'm working with, as people might know, Canadian Wollastonite up on Highway 15 at Meldrum Bay. We're increasing their Hydro One service, and then we want to put in net metering and do solar. We still have the benefit of the grid, but certainly in that space, looking at off-grid, remote grids as well, and microgrids. So would like to help there if we can.
I love it. Yeah, it's really very interesting. I know we did some work. This is 10 years ago. It was in Resolute Bay. We were trying to figure out, Resolute Bay is about a 1 megawatt diesel generator. And the problem was there's a big science project up there to measure the Aurora Borealis. And we had the University of Calgary. And it was costing $1 million a year to bring the diesel fuel in to run it. It was a 1 megawatt generator, just a crazy price, right? And so we did a lot of work design and put a proposal together to put wind turbines in there and basically try to take as much of the second diesel generator, save $1 million. The problem was the politics, actually, because the money that was used to supplement the diesel could not be diverted to support a wind project.
Oh, geez. Okay.
And it just like it was, I basically threw up in my hands in frustration. We walked away from it, but this was back in 2010, 2011.
Yeah.
But I think it's probably, maybe there's more sense in the government now.
Because Graham is, we don't want to be bleeding edge, do R&D. You want practical off the shelf solutions.
Absolutely.
But with this, like Meldrum Bay, I mean, he's pretty deep into NRCan grants, and they're very, very interested in funding these things. And you try to say they're unique and novel. Hopefully they're not. You work with some of the large equipment vendors like the NRCons or whoever, but Siemens, Schneider, whoever, right? They've got some pretty interesting technologies.
No, I think it's great. I think what you're doing, and maybe it would be interesting to, maybe you and I could talk offline.
Yeah, offline.
We'll get in touch.
Yep. Thanks.
Perfect. Maybe I don't see any more questions specifically, but so is there anything in like news briefs? I usually go through the standard, transportation, wind, solar, bio, anything that anybody would like to talk about on that.
We don't want to talk about politics in the U.S.
Well, go for it. If you want.
I just said a thing to Rob that if the Conservatives get in, he's working with NRCan, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of that stuff, unfortunately, may go away just following the Trump model in the U.S. And that's a big concern, too, especially for people like David working properly with granting organizations and universities. It may have a devastating effect on us as well.
Yeah, we live in scary times, don't we?
Harriet, with a question.
Oh, I see Tom's got his hand up.
I was trying to be optimistic, Carol.
Tom.
There is some news on the small modular reactor front. There's a Canadian company called Terrestrial Energy that was based in Oakville. And in the past year, they moved their head office to the US because they found that was more government funding in the US to finish their R&D and develop their designs. They've announced just this week that Texas A&M University is willing to host their first of a kind reactor. And what's unique about the terrestrial energy design is that it actually uses a molten salt design rather than using water or heavy water. So it actually is quite an advance. As a matter of fact, the university is hosting 4 different manufacturers of molten salt reactors. And so this is going to be, I believe, a step change in the use of uranium because molten salt has an operating temperature of around 600 degrees C rather than 300 if you use water. And all of a sudden, you can think of all other sorts of uses when you have this high temperature available. I'm thinking industrial processes and perhaps even for our heavy oil out in Western Canada.
Well, I know, Tom, you'd said that you're happy to come back and do a part 2. We'll look forward to that at some point. I try and keep our board members on reserve for talks. It's easier to twist arms. Anyway, we're coming up to the end of the session. First off, David, thank you ever so much for letting the cat out of the bag with the Humble Switch community. Much appreciated. Yeah, as everybody has said, a stellar talk, sobering, yet don't put out a problem unless you can put out solutions to it. So it's nice to see the yin and the yang on that. So much appreciated. Happy to hear how it goes moving forward. And Darko, yes.
I just wanted to add that very soon this will be posted on our website. So this would be wonderful because not only the presentation is so good, but I enjoy the whole discussion. So this can be a good source for David to pass around the link and so on.
True.
Given that this is the first time you are giving a talk about this.
Yeah, you heard it here first, folks. Again, everybody have a very pleasant Friday and weekend. And next month, we will be having Dr. Brendan McDonald from Xterra. He's a faculty member. I'm drawing a blank on which university in Southern Ontario, so unfortunately. Anyway, he's got a new Stirling engine energy concept that he will be talking to us about. So, and I'm pretty sure we have April lined up as well with a talk from one of Rosie's colleagues, former colleagues at Stantec on district energy. So stay tuned, and we'll be getting out details as they appear. Thank you, everybody, and have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.